I died in a hospital bed holding a stranger's hand, and woke up in a stranger's life holding a phone call that was about to change everything. The dying part, I remember clearly enough, the long illness, the quiet hospice room, my own mother's hand in mine since she was the only family I'd ever known, and then nothing, the particular nothing of a long goodbye finally finishing. What I didn't expect was to open my eyes again at all. I was standing in an unfamiliar kitchen, in a body that felt both foreign and immediately, unmistakably mine, and my phone, a phone I'd never owned, in a life I didn't recognize, was buzzing with an incoming call from a number labeled, simply, Hartley Family Lawyer. I answered it, because some instinct in this borrowed life already knew I should. Miss Bennett, the voice on the other end said, careful, formal, the voice of someone delivering news they'd rehearsed. My name is Walter Greaves. I represent the Hartley family. I have some news that's going to be very difficult to hear, and I need you to sit down before I say anything else. I sat down. I had no idea, yet, that I was about to be told I was someone else's daughter, someone wealthy, someone who had spent 26 years searching, without knowing it, for the baby that had been stolen from them at birth. This is that story. There was a deathbed confession, Walter Greaves told me, once I'd managed to say I was sitting down. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Ruth Castellan, she worked as a maid for the Hartley family for almost 30 years, going back to before either of their daughters was born. She confessed, to her priest and then to me, that she had switched 2 infants at the hospital, 26 years ago. Her own newborn daughter, for the Hartleys' biological daughter. I sat very still, in a kitchen I didn't recognize, holding a phone with hands that were mine now in every way that mattered, and let that land. The DNA results came back yesterday, Greaves continued. You are Eleanor Hartley's and Richard Hartley's biological daughter, Miss Bennett. The woman who has been living as their daughter for 26 years, Daphne, Ruth Castellan's actual child, is not. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for everything that came after. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel the dizzy thrill of discovering I was secretly wealthy, secretly important, secretly owed something the world had withheld from me. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of vertigo, the specific disorientation of being told that an entire family, a real one, with 2 real parents and a sister I'd never met, had spent 26 years missing a person who had, this whole time, been living an entirely different life under an entirely different name. What happens now? I asked. The Hartleys would like to meet you, Greaves said. As soon as you're willing. I should tell you, Miss Bennett, this is going to be difficult, for everyone involved. Daphne doesn't know yet. The family hasn't decided how to tell her. I'd encourage you to prepare yourself for a complicated welcome, at least at first. I didn't know, in that moment, exactly how complicated. I would learn, over the following weeks, that complicated had been a significant understatement. But I said yes. Of course I said yes, not because I was hungry for a wealthy family's inheritance, though I understood, even then, how that might look to anyone watching from the outside. I said yes because somewhere in Priya Bennett's, no, in my memories now, the borrowed life I'd woken into, there was an entire childhood of being raised by 2 people who loved me without ever once needing to be my biological parents to do it, and some part of me wanted, very badly, to understand the family that had spent 26 years grieving a daughter they'd never even gotten the chance to know was missing. The Hartley house was enormous, the kind of house I'd only ever seen in photographs, with a circular drive and a garden that looked tended by people whose entire job was tending it, and I stood at the front door for a long moment before I worked up the nerve to ring the bell, the memories of this borrowed life supplying a churn of nerves that felt entirely my own. Eleanor Hartley opened the door herself. She was perhaps 50, elegant in the understated way that money sometimes produces, and the moment she saw my face, something happened to her own that I will remember for a long time, a flicker of recognition so total, so immediate, that I understood, watching it happen, that whatever doubts the DNA test might have needed to resolve for anyone else, Eleanor Hartley had resolved the moment she saw me standing on her porch. You have my mother's eyes, she said, very quietly, and then, as though she hadn't meant to say anything at all, pressed a hand to her mouth and simply looked at me for a long moment, tears gathering, unhidden. Richard Hartley appeared behind her, taller, quieter, the kind of man whose emotions moved more slowly to the surface but were, I would learn, no less real for the delay, and he said nothing for a long moment either, just looked at me with an expression that was trying, visibly, to hold itself together. Come in, Eleanor said, finally. Please. We have so much to talk about, and I don't even know where to start. We talked for hours that first evening, about the hospital where I'd been born, about the early weeks Eleanor remembered with her newborn, Weeks that I now understood had actually belonged to a different baby entirely. About the years of a nagging unease Eleanor admitted she'd never been able to name, a feeling, she said, that she'd always dismissed as new mother anxiety, that something about her daughter never quite seemed to fit the family the way it should. I want you to know, Eleanor said, toward the end of that first evening, taking my hand across the kitchen table, that none of this is your fault, or Daphne's fault. Whatever happens next, and I don't fully know what happens next, I won't pretend I do. I want you to know we're grateful you're here. 26 years late. But here. I believed her, that night. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for what came later. I believed, completely, in the genuine warmth of that first evening, the real tears, the real grief for 26 lost years. In the days that followed, before Daphne knew anything at all, Richard showed me the nursery, still standing, somehow, after 26 years, repurposed now into a small reading room but with traces of its original purpose still visible if you knew where to look. A faded border of small painted birds along the ceiling, a single drawer in an otherwise replaced dresser that had survived every renovation because, Richard admitted, quietly, no one in the family had ever quite been able to bring themselves to remove it. I used to come in here sometimes, he said, after we realized something felt wrong, though we couldn't have told you what, exactly. I'd just sit in here, and look at the birds on the ceiling, and wonder if I was imagining the unease, or if some part of me had always known something didn't add up. He looked at me, then, with an expression I hadn't yet learned to read fully, this early in knowing him. I don't know how to tell you what it means, having you actually stand in this room. I've imagined it for 26 years and none of my imagining prepared me for what it would actually feel like. I didn't have an answer for that, not really. I just stood with him, in a room meant for a baby who'd grown up entirely without it, and felt, for the first time since waking into this borrowed life, something that felt almost like belonging. I held on to that feeling carefully, in the months that followed, the way you hold on to proof that something real had existed, even after everything else around it started to shift. What I didn't yet understand was how quickly that warmth could be reshaped, once Daphne found out what was coming for her. The family told Daphne 3 days later, in a conversation I wasn't present for, and by the time I saw her for the first time, at a dinner Eleanor had arranged, hopeful and visibly nervous about how it would go, Daphne had clearly had time to decide exactly how she wanted this story to be told. She was beautiful, in the particular way the Hartley name and the Hartley money had clearly cultivated over 26 years, polished, composed, every detail of her appearance suggesting a woman who had never once had to wonder where her next meal was coming from. But the moment she saw me, something flickered across her face, fast, calculating, gone before anyone else at the table seemed to notice it. Then she stood, and crossed the room, and embraced me, and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, I'm so glad you're here. I always felt like something was missing in this family. Now I understand what it was. It was, I would come to realize, a masterful opening move, warm, generous, the kind of statement that positioned her, immediately, as gracious rather than threatened, magnanimous rather than desperate. The rest of the family visibly relaxed, watching it, relieved that the dreaded confrontation between the two daughters had gone so smoothly. I smiled, and thanked her, and said something appropriately warm in return, because what else was there to do, in a room full of people who clearly wanted this evening to be easy. But over the following weeks, I started to notice the gap between what Daphne said in front of the family and what she did when she believed no one significant was watching. She cried, often, in front of Eleanor, not about losing her place in the family, she was always careful to clarify, but about the unfairness of it all, about how confusing it was to suddenly question her entire identity, about how hard she was trying to be generous when everything in her life had just been upended without warning. Each conversation, I noticed, ended with Eleanor comforting her, reassuring her, promising that nothing needed to change too quickly, that the family would figure this out together, slowly, with care for everyone's feelings. Including, conspicuously, Daphne's feelings. Less conspicuously, mine. I didn't say anything, at first. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading malice into ordinary grief, because Daphne's situation was, genuinely, difficult, whatever else was also true about it. She'd just learned her entire life was built on a lie she had no part in creating. Some sympathy seemed only fair. It was at the 6-week mark, at a family lunch, that I understood exactly how deliberately that sympathy was being engineered. Daphne mentioned, casually, over dessert, that she'd noticed some money missing from the household account Eleanor managed for charitable donations, not a huge amount, but odd, you know? I just thought everyone should know, in case it's relevant to anything. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. The implication arrived in the room anyway, settling over the table like a held breath, and I watched Eleanor's expression shift, very slightly, into something that hadn't been there a moment before. Suspicion. I want to describe the months that followed carefully, because I think the mechanism mattered more than any single incident. Daphne never accused me of anything directly. She was far too careful for that. What she did, instead, was plant small, plausible doubts, one at a time, each one too minor to challenge without seeming paranoid or defensive myself. The missing charity money turned out, when Eleanor finally checked the records properly, to be nothing more than an accounting delay, a donation that had simply been processed late. But by the time that was confirmed, the suspicion had already done its work. Eleanor never apologized for the brief unease, because nothing had technically been said against me directly, and the whole incident simply evaporated into the family's memory as that confusing thing with the charity account, its origin already forgotten. Then there was the necklace, an heirloom piece of Eleanor's mother's, which went briefly missing from a drawer, and which Daphne, again, mentioned only in passing. Probably nothing, I'm sure it'll turn up, in a tone calibrated to sound like she was defending me rather than implicating me. It turned up 3 days later, in a different drawer, exactly where Eleanor herself had apparently moved it during a reorganizing project she'd forgotten about. But the 3 days in between were enough for a particular kind of watchfulness to settle over the household, directed, I noticed, far more at me than at anyone else who might plausibly have moved an unattended necklace. I tried, several times, to address it directly. I know things have been strange, I said to Eleanor, one evening, choosing my words carefully. I know there's been some tension since I arrived. I just want you to know I'm not here to take anything from anyone. I didn't come here looking for money or status, or to push Daphne out of a life she's lived for 26 years. Of course not, Eleanor said, warmly, and patted my hand, and I believed, in the moment, that she meant it. But I noticed, increasingly, a specific pattern in how the family processed information about me versus information about Daphne. When I was late to a family dinner, having been caught in traffic, it became, by the time Daphne mentioned it a week later, she doesn't seem that invested in actually being part of this family, does she? When Daphne was late to the same kind of event, it was simply Daphne being Daphne, scattered and busy, never mentioned again. When I expressed an honest opinion that differed from Eleanor's, it became evidence of difficulty adjusting. When Daphne did the same thing, it was refreshing honesty. I didn't understand, for a long time, why the pattern was so consistently lopsided, until I realized that Daphne wasn't simply being unkind to me, in these moments. She was performing a particular kind of grief and resilience for an audience that had spent 26 years building an emotional architecture around her, an architecture that made any criticism of her feel, to that audience, like a betrayal of everything they'd already invested. I was the new variable. She was 26 years of established love. It was always going to be an unfair fight, structurally, regardless of who was telling the truth. The breaking point came in the 4th month, with a letter that arrived, supposedly, from an old friend of Ruth Castellan's, the maid whose deathbed confession had started all of this, claiming that Ruth had told her, before she died, that she'd actually swapped the babies because the Hartleys' biological daughter had shown signs of a serious illness at birth, and Ruth had wanted to save her own healthy baby from a family she believed would face devastating medical costs and grief. It was, on its surface, a sympathetic reframing, not theft, but a desperate, misguided act of protection. And it shifted the entire emotional center of the story, subtly but completely. If the swap had been about saving Daphne from a doomed family situation, then Daphne's 26 years in the Hartley household started to look less like a stolen inheritance and more like fate correcting an unfair draw, and my sudden appearance started to look less like justice finally served and more like an inconvenient technicality disrupting something that had, in its own way, worked out for the best. The letter was unsigned beyond a first name. The friend was never produced for a direct conversation. And when I asked, gently, whether anyone had actually verified the letter's claims with Walter Greaves, who had access to the original hospital records, Eleanor's response told me everything I needed to know about where the family's sympathies had actually settled by then. I don't think we need to interrogate every detail, she said, a new coolness in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me before. I think it's enough to know that whatever happened, it happened out of love, even if it was misguided. I think focusing on exactly who did what to whom isn't helping anyone heal. It would help me, I said, quietly, to know whether the story being told about my own birth is actually true. Eleanor didn't answer that directly. And in the silence that followed, I understood, with a Clarity that hurt more than I expected, exactly how far the ground had shifted beneath me in 4 short months. I called Walter Greaves myself, that night. There's no record of any illness, he told me, after checking, his voice careful, apologetic. I've seen the original hospital file, Miss Bennett. You were a healthy newborn. There's no medical basis for the claim in that letter at all. Then where did it come from? I don't know, he admitted. But I'd encourage you to consider who might benefit from the family believing it. I already knew. I'd known since the moment Eleanor chose not to ask the obvious question. I stopped trying to win the family's trust through warmth alone, after the letter. It wasn't that I stopped being warm, I want to be clear about that, because I think it would have been easy, at that point, to become bitter, defensive, exactly the kind of difficult presence Daphne had been quietly suggesting I already was. But I understood, finally, that warmth wasn't going to be enough on its own, in a household where warmth had already been claimed, 26 years ago, by someone who knew exactly how to perform it more convincingly than I ever would, simply because she'd had more practice. What I needed was proof. Not feelings, not character, proof. I went back to Walter Greaves, and asked him to help me understand exactly what records existed from the time of the swap, hospital logs, staff schedules, anything that might independently corroborate or contradict the story Ruth Castellan had supposedly told her unnamed friend. It took 3 weeks of careful, unglamorous work. Walter pulled archived hospital staffing records, cross-referenced against Ruth Castellan's known work schedule as the Hartley's maid, and found something that mattered more than I'd expected. Ruth had taken an unexplained week of leave from her maid duties at the exact time of the swap, a week that, according to her own personnel file from decades earlier, she'd told the Hartleys was for a family emergency. A family emergency that placed her near the hospital, at exactly the right time, with exactly the kind of access a longtime household maid might have to information about which families were giving birth, which babies might be easy to substitute, which parents were too exhausted or distracted in those first days to notice anything wrong. It wasn't a confession, but it was a fact, independent of anyone's interpretation, and facts, I'd learned by then, were worth more in this family than any amount of sincerity. I also did something else, in those 3 weeks, something that had nothing to do with the Hartleys at all, and everything to do with remembering who I actually was, underneath the borrowed memories of a life I'd been thrown into. I called my adoptive parents. I don't know what to do, I admitted to my mother, on the phone, my voice cracking for the first time since this whole strange chapter of my life had begun. I thought finding my biological family would feel like coming home. Instead, it feels like fighting a war one didn't start, against someone who's better at it than I am. You don't have to win their love, my mother said, gently. You already have ours. Whatever happens with the Hartleys, whether they ever actually see you clearly, you already have a family that chose you on purpose, every single day, for 26 years. That's not nothing, sweetheart. That's actually the rarer thing. I held on to that conversation for the rest of what came next, the way you hold onto a single fixed point in a room that's spinning. I drove out to see them the following weekend, needing, more than I'd admitted on the phone, to simply sit in the house I'd actually grown up in, surrounded by furniture that had never once needed explaining, in rooms where no one had ever questioned whether I belonged. My father, a quiet man who'd never been especially good with words, met me at the door and simply hugged me for a long moment before saying anything at all. You look tired, he said, finally, pulling back to study my face. Real tired, not just busy tired. It's been a hard few months, I admitted. You don't have to go back there, you know, he said, carefully, not quite meeting my eyes, the way he always avoided eye contact when he was saying something that mattered enormously to him. Whatever you're looking for from those people, I don't know if it's there to find. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I just want you to know you're allowed to stop looking, if it's costing you more than it's giving you. I know, I said. I'm not ready to stop yet. But I needed to remember why I'd want to keep going, before I went back in. He nodded and didn't push further, and that evening, over a dinner my mother had clearly spent all afternoon preparing, the 3 of us talked about ordinary things. My father's garden, a neighbor's new dog, nothing at all about hospital records or unexplained weeks of leave or a stepsister performing grief for an increasingly suspicious audience. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of evening I'd been missing without fully understanding what I'd been missing. A room where nothing about my presence needed to be proven, argued for, or defended. I went back to the Hartley house 3 days later, steadier than I'd arrived the weekend before, carrying not just the hospital records Walter and I had assembled, but something less tangible and more important, a clear, settled understanding of exactly how much I already had, regardless of how the next conversation went. The opportunity to use what I'd learned arrived sooner than I expected, at a dinner Eleanor had organized, ostensibly to celebrate Richard's birthday, though I understood, by then, that most Hartley family gatherings had become, beneath their surface pleasantness, quiet referendums on which daughter the family was choosing to believe. Daphne arrived with a new piece of the story, delivered with her now familiar performance of reluctant honesty. "I hate to bring this up again," she said, to the table, "but I've been thinking about that letter. About Ruth's friend. I actually think I might know who she is. I think she might be willing to come forward, if the family wants real closure on this." It was a clever escalation, producing, finally, the witness whose absence had been the letter's weakest point, just as the family's patience for unresolved doubt was wearing thin enough to want one badly. "I'd love to meet her," I said, calmly, before anyone else could respond. "I think that would actually help, because I've also been doing some research these past few weeks, and I found something I'd like everyone to see first, just so we're all working from the same complete picture, before anyone new joins the conversation." I laid out what Walter and I had found. Ruth's unexplained week of leave, exactly coinciding with the hospital stay, with no record anywhere of any family emergency that could be verified, despite Ruth having, by every other account, an unremarkable and well-documented family life with no crises during that period. "This doesn't prove anything about a sympathetic motive," I said. "It doesn't even disprove the letter's story entirely. Maybe there really was a family emergency that simply wasn't recorded anywhere. But it does mean the timeline lines up exactly with opportunity, regardless of motive. And I think, before anyone meets a new witness with a new version of events, we should ask exactly the same standard of evidence from that witness that I've just tried to meet myself." The table was quiet. "Where did you get hospital staffing records?" Daphne asked, and I heard, underneath the casual curiosity, something sharper. Something that sounded almost like alarm. "Walter helped me," I said. "It's all verifiable. I'm happy to share everything with everyone, including whoever this new witness turns out to be." Daphne's witness never materialized. I want to note that plainly, because it mattered more than almost anything else that happened that evening. In the weeks that followed, every time the family asked, gently, when this person might be available to talk, Daphne had a new excuse, busy, hesitant, reconsidering whether she wanted to get involved at all, until the excuses simply stopped, and the witness, like the missing necklace, evaporated quietly from the family's collective memory. It was Eleanor, in the end, who asked the question that finally cracked everything open, not because of the hospital records alone, though I think they mattered, but because something in her had clearly been sitting uneasily with the whole situation for longer than she'd let herself admit. She came to find me alone, 2 weeks after that dinner, in the small guest room I'd been using during my visits, and sat down across from me with an expression I hadn't seen from her since that very first evening on the porch. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is something I don't want to hear." "Okay," I said. "Do you think Daphne has been lying to us?" Eleanor asked. "Not mistaken, not grieving in a complicated way. Actually, deliberately, lying, about the missing money, the necklace, the letter, all of it?" I thought carefully about how to answer, because I understood that this question, asked plainly after 4 months of careful evasion, meant something had finally shifted in Eleanor herself, some private calculation she'd been resisting making out loud. "I think," I said, slowly, "that Daphne found out, the same day the rest of us did, that her entire life was built on something she had no part in creating. And I think that's a genuinely terrible thing to learn. But I also think, somewhere in the months since, she decided that the easiest way to keep her place in this family wasn't to share it honestly with me. It was to make sure I never felt safe enough here to stay. And I think every single doubt that's been raised about me, these past 4 months, has happened to arrive exactly when Daphne needed the family's attention pointed somewhere other than at her." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the particular flatness of someone admitting something they'd known, on some level, for a while. "I think I've known that," she said, "for longer than I wanted to admit. I think I let myself believe the doubts about you because believing them was easier than facing what it would mean to actually lose the daughter I raised, even though, biologically, she was never." She stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth, and for a long moment didn't say anything else at all. "I'm not asking you to stop loving her," I said, gently. "She's still the person you raised. That's real, whatever else is also true. I'm only asking you to actually see what's been happening, instead of choosing not to, because choosing not to has cost me 4 months of being treated like a threat in a house that was supposed to be the place I finally belonged. Eleanor nodded, slowly, and didn't say anything else that evening. But 3 days later, she confronted Daphne directly, with the hospital records, with the vanished witness, with 4 months of small, plausible doubts laid out in a single unbroken line that, once assembled, was impossible to read any other way. Daphne didn't confess cleanly. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters for understanding exactly who she was, underneath the performance. She cried, she accused Eleanor of choosing a stranger over the daughter who'd actually been there, she insisted, right up until the moment she finally stormed out of the house, that none of it had been deliberate, that she'd simply been scared, that anyone in her position would have done the same thing. Maybe that was even partly true. I never fully decided, but, scared, didn't explain the unsigned letter, or the carefully timed doubts about missing valuables, or the witness who never quite materialized. Scared explained the first few weeks. Everything after that had been a choice, repeated, deliberately, for 4 months. I expected, after Daphne left that house, that everything would simply settle into place, that the family would turn back to me, fully, with the warmth they'd shown that first evening on the porch, now that the obstacle to it had been honestly named and removed. It didn't happen quite that cleanly. I want to be honest about that, because I think the honest version of this story matters more than a tidy one. Eleanor tried. In the weeks after Daphne left, she called more often, visited more, asked careful questions about my life, my adoptive family, the years she'd missed, questions that came from genuine grief, I believed, rather than performance. Richard, too, made an effort I hadn't expected from him, sitting with me for long quiet afternoons, telling me stories about Eleanor's pregnancy, about the nursery they'd prepared for a daughter they hadn't known, even then, wasn't coming home with them. But something in me had changed, over those 4 months, that I couldn't simply undo because the threat had finally been removed. I kept thinking about Eleanor's hesitation, not the suspicion itself, exactly, but the months of choosing comfortable doubt over difficult honesty, even after some part of her had clearly suspected the truth. I kept thinking about how easily an entire household had been willing to let me become the explanation for every small inconvenience, simply because believing in me was newer, and therefore costlier, than believing in the daughter they'd already invested 26 years into. I understood why it had happened. Understanding it, though, didn't make it feel like the kind of love I actually wanted to spend the rest of my life building a home around. I sat with that realization for almost 2 weeks before I said anything to Eleanor about it. Turning it over carefully, the way you turn over a decision you suspect is going to disappoint people you've started, genuinely, to care about, even if you no longer fully trust them. I need to tell you something, I said, finally, on a quiet afternoon in the garden, the same garden I'd admired from the porch on that very first evening, what felt like a lifetime ago by then. And I need you to hear all of it before you respond, because I think it's going to be hard to hear, and I want to say it completely before either of us starts trying to fix it. Eleanor went very still, the particular stillness of someone bracing for a loss she'd already half expected. I'm not going to be a Hartley, I said. Not in the way I think you're hoping. I'm grateful, genuinely, deeply grateful, that you found me, that you wanted me, that some part of this family has tried, this past month, to actually see me clearly instead of just managing the discomfort of my existence. But I think I came here looking for something I already have, somewhere else, and I think the 4 months it took for anyone in this house to choose honesty over comfort taught me something about what I actually need from the people closest to me. What do you need? Eleanor asked, quietly. Her eyes were already wet. I need to not have to fight to be believed, I said. I need people who choose me on purpose, every day, the way my adoptive parents have, since before I could even understand what choosing meant. I think you love me, Eleanor. I really do. But I think it took you 4 months of watching me get hurt to remember that love is supposed to come with that kind of certainty, and I don't think I can build the rest of my life around a family that needed 4 months and a stack of hospital records to get there. I didn't cut the Hartleys off entirely. I want to be clear about that, because I think a clean, dramatic severing would have made for a more satisfying story and a less honest one. Eleanor and Richard remained, in the years that followed, a part of my life, smaller than they might have hoped for, larger than I'd expected, in the strange, slow, ongoing way that complicated relationships sometimes settle into something workable without ever becoming simple. But I went home, that month, to the parents who had raised me, to a modest house with a kitchen that had never once needed tending by anyone but the people who lived in it, to a mother who hugged me at the door the way she had every single day of my childhood, without needing a DNA test or a deathbed confession to know exactly who I was to her. How was it? My mother asked, that first evening home, settling beside me on the same worn couch I'd grown up on. Hard, I admitted. Harder than I expected, in ways I didn't expect. I think I learned something about love I wish I hadn't had to learn the hard way. What's that? That it's not about who's biologically supposed to love you, I said. It's about who actually shows up, every day, choosing you on purpose, even when it would be easier not to. You and Dad did that for 26 years, without ever once needing to be asked, and the family that was biologically supposed to do it automatically still managed to take 4 months to get there, even with proof sitting right in front of them. I'm glad you're home, she said. Me too, I said. I think I finally understand what home actually means. It's been 2 years. I still hear from Eleanor occasionally, a card at the holidays, a phone call on my birthday, the careful, respectful distance of someone who understands, finally, what she lost and isn't trying to pretend otherwise. Daphne, as far as I know, moved to another city after she left. The Hartley house, I've heard, through Walter Greaves, who still checks in from time to time, that she's working an ordinary job, living an ordinary life, the inherited wealth and status gone along with the inherited name she was never actually entitled to. I don't feel triumphant about that, the way I might have expected to, in the angrier months. Right after everything fell apart. Mostly I just feel settled, the specific, quiet relief of having asked myself an honest question and trusted the honest answer, even when the honest answer cost me something that, on paper, looked like it should have been the better deal. I think about the hospital records sometimes, the unexplained week of leave, the maid who took a healthy baby and gave a family a substitute they spent 26 years loving anyway, imperfectly, conditionally, but genuinely. I think Ruth Castellan's confession, at the very end of her life, came from a real place of guilt, even if the story she'd apparently told her friend about saving a sick baby was never true. I think guilt, like love, doesn't always wait for the convenient moment to surface. Sometimes it just arrives, decades late, and rearranges every life it touches whether anyone asked it to or not. I think about Daphne too, sometimes, not with warmth, exactly, but with something close to understanding. She didn't choose to be raised as someone else's daughter. She only chose. What she did once she found out, and what she chose was fear, dressed up as grief, repeated until it became cruelty. I don't think that makes her a monster. I think it makes her a person who failed a test most people never have to take, and I try, most days, to hold that thought without letting it turn into either excuse or bitterness. My adoptive parents are older now, slower, and I spend more time with them than I think I would have if any of this had never happened. A strange gift, buried inside an otherwise painful chapter of my life. The gift of understanding exactly how rare and deliberate their love had always been, and choosing, every day since, not to take it for granted again. I never did find out how I ended up living this life, why I woke up as Eleanor and Richard's biological daughter, in the exact moment Walter Greaves was calling with the news, instead of simply continuing whatever life I'd been living before. I've stopped expecting an answer. Some mysteries, I've learned, don't need solving in order to teach you something true. Last spring, Eleanor invited me back to the house on Cedar Lane for an afternoon, a small, quiet visit, nothing like the fraught family dinners of those first 4 months. She showed me into the old nursery, the one Richard had taken me to on my very first visit, and I noticed, immediately, that something had changed in it. The faded birds along the ceiling border had been carefully restored, repainted in the same soft, old-fashioned style, as though someone had taken great care to preserve exactly what had always been there rather than replace it with something new. I had it done last year, Eleanor said, watching my face. I'm not asking you to come back, or to forgive everything, or to pretend the last few years went differently than they did. I just wanted there to be one room in this house that finally looked the way it was always supposed to look, whether or not you ever spend much time in it. I stood in that small room for a long while, looking at the birds, thinking about a version of my life where I might have grown up here instead, a life I would never know, that had simply never happened, swapped away before I'd had the chance to take a single breath of it. Thank you, I said, finally, for finishing it, even this late. 26 years late, Eleanor said, with a small, sad smile, echoing her own words from that very first evening. I suppose lateness is the theme of this whole family, where you're concerned. I laughed, despite myself, and she laughed too, and for a moment, standing together in that small restored room, it felt like something real had finally settled into its proper place. Not the family I'd come looking for, exactly, but a smaller, quieter, more honest version of what we'd actually become to each other. not mother and daughter, not quite, but not strangers either. Something in between, built slowly, on terms we'd both finally stopped pretending were simpler than they actually were. I drove home that evening to the house with the worn couch, where my real mother, the one who'd never once needed a hospital record to know exactly who I was, had dinner waiting, the way she had every single evening of my entire childhood, without ever once needing to be asked twice. What I know is this. I was given, briefly, the chance to reclaim a family that had every biological right to love me, and I learned, slowly and painfully, that biological right isn't the same as love freely given. I already had that. I'd had it for 26 years, in a small house with a worn couch and a mother who never once needed proof. I just had to lose something else first, to understand exactly how much I already had. That was the story of a woman who got everything she thought she wanted, and chose to walk away from it anyway. Not because the Hartleys never loved her, they did, in their own slow, imperfect, conditional way. But because somewhere in 4 difficult months, she learned the difference between a family that loves you when it's easy, and a family that's been choosing you on purpose every single day, long before anyone ever needed to prove it with a DNA test. Give this video a like if you'd have made the same choice. Subscribe to Villain Novels for a new story every week. Drop in the comments, what was the moment that got you? I read every single one.